Welcome to this special edition of Philosophy in the Bookshop, our regular monthly discussion with philosophers, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome, I would say, the two world experts on Isaiah Berlin. On my right, Henry Hardy, who knew Berlin for many years and worked very, very closely with him, as he'll talk about. On my left, Johnny Lyons, who's recently written this book on the philosophy of Isaiah Berlin, which is an excellent introduction. Henry has written a book here about, it's called In Search of Isaiah Berlin, but it's about his long-term relationship with Berlin, which is both, well, it's a bit like a marriage in some respects, but I'm sure he can elaborate on that. Both are brilliant books, and you'll have an opportunity to purchase them and get them signed by the authors afterwards. The format for today is the same as it always is, which is that we'll have a discussion for about half an hour between the three of us, it's normally between two of us, and then open the floor up for questions. So if you've got a question, we'll have about half an hour for questions, and then we'll finish at midday, and if you'd like to buy their books, they're just over there. I don't know if we have a signing table. We can probably set it up there or somewhere. Okay, so let's start with Henry. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you came to write this book, In Search of Isaiah Berlin, and what it captures about your relationship with him.
Yeah, Isaiah Berlin, I've been told to assume that some of you at any rate, won't know who he is, so please forgive me those who know it all already if I say stuff you already know. But anyway, he was a Russian Jewish emigre whose whole career was spent here in Oxford. And he was a political philosopher and a general philosopher, and he wrote a great deal. Much of it wasn't published by the time he was about 60. When I met him, I went to Wolfson College as a graduate student to do a B.Phil in philosophy, and he was the president there. I met him in 1972, and I had a kind of pre-existing taste for doing editorial projects of one kind or another, fairly unimportant ones up to that point. I like founding and running magazines. I like collecting people's scattered writings and making them into a coherent book and that sort of thing. And it soon became clear that Berlin was an absolutely perfect victim for my obsessive tastes. So I spent the rest of my life really one way and another since then until now, still doing it, finding, collecting, editing his works and putting them into books, and then his letters as well, latterly. And so I had a long, well, I knew him till he died, so that was 25 years, give or take. And so I got to know him really well. And the whole business of working on his papers was extremely fascinating, absorbing, problematic, revealing in various ways. So there was a story there which I thought was of interest. And the first part of my book tells that story, or tries to tell that story. At the same time, I was, of course, I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't fascinated by his ideas. And I came to grips with his ideas all the time I was working just as an editor. I was trying to understand the ideas and make sense of things which I found I disagreed with or thought were problematic in various ways. And there were two main threads in his work which I concentrated on, and I wrote him letters all through my friendship with him, in which I set out my problems and he gave me his replies. I did it in letters because he was entirely incapable in discussion of sticking to the point. If you raised a point to him, a question was just a starting point for a kind of a fantastic tour d'horizon of culture. You know, he would go off on a tangent. He would associations of ideas. It was wonderfully entertaining, but absolutely maddening if what you wanted to do was to find the answer to a question, let alone more than one question. So there came to exist this body of letters in which I pressed him and he answered, and the second part of the book contains those letters and my commentary on them.
Could you just say what the two problems were that you focused on?
Yes, the first was one of my own invention in a way. He had one of the most important claims he made was that there can, in principle, be no single provable, correct way of living. No one answer to the deep questions of life.
He unfortunately chose the name Final Solution.
He did.
There is no final solution.
There is no final solution which can be proved and therefore, let alone forced on everybody. So that's one of the deepest sources of his liberalism. Now, I took the view, I was brought up, as so many people in this culture, in a religious tradition, in my case Anglicanism, in his case it was Judaism. And I took the view that that belief of his meant that none of the major religions of the world could be accepted because they did claim to have a final solution of a kind. And we had a long argument about that, and he never really accepted it, although in the end I think he sort of did, but you must form your own view of that. So the first issue is, I think that I thought that religious belief just had to be ruled out because of his other beliefs, and that was one topic.
And what was the second?
And the second was his view of human nature. It's a complicated area, but he was a pluralist, which is to say he believed that human goals, ends, values are multiple and can't be all reduced to a single common currency. So utilitarians, for example, said that everything we do can be judged in terms of its utility. And he said we have different goals, and different values like liberty, equality, dignity, variety, whatever it might be, and these are all distinct. They all make distinctive demands on us, and they can't be all put together in one single system that makes sense of everything in one structure. And that was called pluralism. And the difficulty with that is that, one difficulty with it is that people think it boils down to something called relativism, which means that you can do whatever you like, that anything goes, that there's no restriction on what are reasonable human objectives and values. So he had another element in his thought, which was he called, what did he call it, the moral core, or the human horizon, which was a kind of conception of human nature which limited what we could reasonably do. And I wanted to understand more clearly than I thought he made clear in his writings exactly what his conception of human nature was. What are the limits that we're subject to? What is the degree of variety open to us, and how do you reconcile these two sides?
That sounds very similar to the sort of thing that Sartre struggled with in his famous lecture, Existentialism and Humanism, that if God is dead, anything is possible, and Sartre thought God clearly was dead, and existentialists thought there wasn't even a preconceived human nature. How can you limit the actions that people can take against each other? And his solution at that point was to go Kantian and imply that if you make a choice for yourself, you're somehow modelling your vision of what it is to be human. So you're presenting yourself as a universal, as it were, and that puts constraints on it, because you couldn't will certain sorts of evil actions for everybody in every epoch, or even for your own epoch. How did Isaiah Berlin solve that problem?
Well, he certainly thought that there was such a thing as human nature, and I'm entirely with him on that. Of course, it's problematic to spell out in exact detail what this amounts to. In fact, probably it's necessarily impossible to do that, because it's a very fluid situation, and you can't give a list of 19 things you have to be a human being. But there are certain absolute limits. So, to take an obvious one, gratuitous killing of people for no reason is just wrong. And there's, if you take an entirely relativist view, if I like killing people, then I can do that. He said, we gave an example. He said, I prefer kindness, you prefer concentration camps. It's just a matter of taste.
But he implying that it really wasn't.
It really isn't a matter of taste. No, there are.
And yet there were people who made that decision who were human. So in a sense, it is part of their human nature, and consistent with the Kantian line that he did take, whereas he repeated that line from Kant that out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. So how did he get around that? Because people clearly do make those decisions. So in a sense, it must be part of being human to have the capacity to do evil against each other.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a whole aspect of humanity that he talked about too little. He I mean, there is the thing called original sin, which is another name for what you've just described. And clearly, human beings, including each one of us, has capacity to do appalling things at times. And he always he was preferred to explain people's bad behavior in terms of misunderstanding. So he would say, they didn't really see why what they were doing was wrong, or they were misled by an argument. For example, the Nazis were misled by an argument, or persuaded by an argument, that Jews were subhuman, and therefore they behaved the way they did.
That sounds like Richard Dawkins talking about religious people, saying, well, they're just stupid. They don't, people are scientists who are religious as well.
Yeah.
They obviously don't think deeply enough. But that can't be what's going on.
No, that can't be what's going on in that case. But I do think that his preference for explaining things in terms of people having poor reasons leaves out of account original sin. It leaves out of account just people's potentialities to be evil or bad.
But also the fact that many people who do good things do them for bad reasons.
Yep, that too.
If it's a prerequisite of good behaviour that you have to do it for good reasons, then there'll be a lot more evil in the world, I think, in the long run. Yeah?
Yes, true enough.
Can I just turn to Johnny now?
Yeah, of course.
So, Johnny, you wrote this book very recently that's just been published by Bloomsbury. How did you get to write the book, and what's the main theme in the book?
Okay, Nigel, so I think there was a very simple practical reason why I wrote the book. I work in the private world. I'm not an academic. I used to be.
Can you say more specifically? The private world sounds like you're an undercover agent. Unless you are.
PI Lyons, I know with my clients. No, so I work in corporate communications. I've worked in a number of companies like multinationals, Pfizer, Diageo. At the moment I work for a bank. I do the same thing. Help people go through change in a corporate landscape. So I've been doing that for the last 20 years. And in a previous life I did lecture in politics and history in Trinity College in Dublin. So the practical reason was I had loads of I had 2 weeks extra annual leave. I mean, if you work in the corporate world, if you don't take your annual leave, you lose it. So I had 2 extra weeks over 2 Christmases ago. And the kids had gone back to school. I found myself doodling, and all of a sudden I'd written a couple of chapters of the book I should have written back in the 90s when I was an academic. So that was what happened. Though I wrote it quite quickly. I wrote it in about 6 months. But I suppose the longer term reason was when I should have written this book was probably the mid-90s, and I got writer's block, stroke some sort of intellectual crisis of confidence, and I abandoned academia pretty much in a day, and then started as a bank teller following a couple of months later, really.
Could you just say, because you've written about this, and which philosopher specifically produced that effect?
Oh yes, well, I have Bernard Williams to blame for that one. In a conversation, I'm not sure if you're aware, Bernard Williams actually was a great friend of Isaiah. And Thomas Nagel, another great philosopher, wrote a collection of essays called Other Minds. And in the introduction to that essay, or those collection of essays, he talks about a conversation he had with Bernard Williams. They were good friends. And Bernard asks the question to Thomas, well, why be a philosopher unless you're going to write something original or really interesting? So it could be interesting, or it could be original, or it could be both. Big, tall order. And as anyone of you know anything about Bernard Williams, pretty demanding mind. And he came out with the view, well, if it's not going to be original, it's not going to be interesting, why bother doing any philosophy? So really, philosophy is for really intelligent, interesting people. And if you're not going to meet those criteria, what's the point? I interpreted that very literally. And I said, I can't see myself fulfilling those criteria, either one of them, let alone both. And I just abandoned it then. And really became a kind of philosopher in disguise. I never really talked about philosophy because I worked in the commercial world. That would not go down well. They'd think you're pompous or all sorts of things, waste of time. So I read my philosophy at night time, and then I only started writing philosophy a couple of years ago, as I said, on the back of that. So, but I suppose my reason for writing the book, more specifically, was I was constantly disappointed by most of the stuff that was written on Isaiah Berlin. And my disappointment was symptomatic of what I think is wrong with a lot of analytic political theory, which I find very dry, very boring, very unrealistic, very removed from the real world. They bring logic into the practical world of politics and morality, and really it's not irrelevant, but it's not nearly as relevant as they think. So, for example, if pluralism doesn't entail in some sort of logical way liberalism, well then, too bad for pluralism, too bad for Berlin. Nonsense, you know. We're not dealing with 2 and 2 is 4 here. We're dealing with values, we're dealing with human ideals. They don't work in that kind of logical way. So that was the inspiration for writing my book. And it's really a kind of, what I think is much a defense of looking at Berlin as a philosopher as opposed to a kind of a disparate essayist or just an historian of ideas. And also a kind of implicit rejection of much of the kind of analytic, academic, political theory that is still dominating the scene.
Could you put in a nutshell what you take the core of Isaiah Berlin's most important philosophy to be? You could say no.
Yes.
Starter for 10.
Well, it's that one, you know, I think also Henry Putnam said, what can we put in a nutshell? It belongs in a nutshell. So I'll try, but, or should stay in a nutshell. So I think, for me, I think Berlin is really saying, at the end of the day, ideas are vital. Intellect, the world of the mind, is vital to life, to human life. And that is still, as far as I can see, still a minority view. And that sounds very, perhaps, dismissive, but when you look at the quality of political debate in most of the time, it's deprived of any kind of intellect, or any kind of genuine engagement with ideas. It's as if nothing's happened since Plato. I mean, I think Plato, if he came, he might expect we've moved on as a species. I think he'd be appalled by what he'd hear most of our politicians say.
Okay, so I interviewed Michael Ignatieff, who almost became a very prominent Canadian politician, but was a historian of ideas, amongst other things. And he said that there isn't really room for ideas in politics. What you need to be is the person in the room who understands what the best they can get out of that situation is, and then acts like a shark. That's what politics is about.
Yes, and I mean, I've read his book. I think it's called Soul and Politics or something like that. And it's a very, I think it's a great book about the challenge of an intellectual in the world of politics. And he largely failed.
Yeah, there's one aspect, I'm sorry to interrupt, that is very important, that he said that he's in the business of entertaining ideas as well as defending them. And as soon as he entertained an idea, he got stuck with it by the press. So that it was almost as if exploring ideas was antithetical with the real political world.
That's right, and I think that is also a reflection of the fact that we live in a world where instrumental reason dominates. So it's all means-end stuff. There's no analysis of what are we trying to get to, as opposed to how do we get there. And the there is never really discussed. The there is usually like, we need to win the next election. But to what purpose? So the discussion is completely dominated by the means, and the means to that ill-defined or usually unjustified or very, very meagre end. And we don't really ever get to the discussion of what are we trying to do in the grander scheme of things. And I think what Berlin reminds us of, these ends, these values, are crucial, even though they conflict, to shaping a meaningful discussion, not just about how you might live your personal life, but how you might build a just society. A just society built on a recognition that our values, our ideals conflict, but that doesn't make them any less objective or valuable.
But he did talk about the kind of tragic aspects of life. Could you say a little bit about that? Because it's not as if he's a utopian thinker in any way.
No, in fact, you could say he's one of the most strident anti-utopian thinkers. As Nigel and Henry were saying, he's a pluralist, so that basically means that he doesn't believe that there's one right way of living your life. An academic lives a certain type of life. It's probably quite solitary, it's very intellectual. Someone like me who works in a bank lives a different type of life. It's more participative, it's more public, it's having to deal with this kind of means-end stuff all the time. And then there's a multiplicity of other ways of living your life. But what Berlin is saying, more on a more tragic level, is you can't achieve the perfect life. So the classic example is, and Berlin sometimes talks about it, is, faced with the choice of, do I mind my ailing mother, in the context of I'm living in France, the Nazis are about to invade Paris, do I join the resistance, fight this evil encroaching enemy, or do I mind my ailing mother? I can't do both. I've got a choice here. And what Berlin is saying is, it's not like the choice between I like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate ice cream. That's subjective in that kind of.
Actually, I just
way.
want to contest that. So Barry Smith would say it probably isn't subjective. And have you talked to him about
the ice cream
taste?
thing?
Yeah.
Yes.
We
yes.
always use those sort of examples, but there are some flavours of ice cream which are objectively nasty.
Yes, that's true. I'd like to think vanilla and chocolate isn't in that category. But I think what he's really saying is that these are non-trivial conflicts. So I'm faced with a non-trivial conflict between patriotism and, a personal demand on me minding my ailing mother. And if I don't mind her, I'm her only son, she may not survive this war. So how do I deal with this conflict? I can't do both. And what Berlin is saying is, this is not just a pragmatic problem, okay? So that's a really important part of his pluralism. He's not just saying in a perfect world, these conflicts would never arise. They are necessarily a part of human life. You can't imagine a world that's conflict-free. And where a lot of philosophers like utilitarians, Kantians, or Christianity is another example, they like to believe that it's coherent to believe in a conflict-free world, whether that's in heaven.
Perspective on the world, or perspectives on the world. Do you both agree on everything?
Absolutely not, no.
I certainly don't.
So where's the point? I'm going to get out of the way. Where's the fundamental point of disagreement philosophically?
Oh Lord, Johnny, help. I mean, we disagreed over lots of little things. I'm just trying to think if there's a deep disagreement between us. Perhaps there isn't.
No, I think it's a question of emphasis, really, isn't it?
It's emphasis style. I mean, we have completely different intellectual styles, both in conversation and on paper. But that doesn't itself entail a difference on important matters of opinion, does it?
No. I'd like to think that Henry's a far better writer than me, so I'll concede that. He's a much greater
I'll
stylist.
accept that if you'll accept that you are a far better thinker than I am.
Got a deal. And it's recorded.
The consequence of that is you need both books to complement each other. Just getting one, you don't get the full picture. But actually, consistent with Berlin, presumably 2 is not the full picture either. Now, something that struck me, I went to see Bernard Williams talk about the final book that he wrote, and I've thought about Isaiah Berlin. Both are thinkers who had the luxury, not only being brilliant people, but the luxury of spending a lot of time reading. And they're immersed in, Bernard Williams is a classical scholar originally, very much immersed in the world of the ancient Greeks. Isaiah Berlin seemed to have read everything in the original languages several times and remembered, probably not the correct quotations, but remembered
the thoughts.
The thoughts,
yes,
absolutely. Yes. So most of us aren't like that. How can we think, if we're so much in this world of ideas, if ideas are so important, how can ordinary human beings learn from these people? I asked a question of Bernard Williams, and he said, well, if philosophy, the kind of genealogical philosophy he wanted to do at the end of his life requires knowing so much about the history of ideas, is it open to ordinary people? And he sort of thought, well, possibly not.
Well, particularly today, because it's a cliche, but we're so subjected to streams of information online in various forms. That we have television, which they didn't have when they were young. There's the endless stuff on the internet. They just did spend a lot of time reading. I think to read something now it requires an effort of will. You really have to sort of push aside all this other stuff and sit down with it. I read virtually nothing. I work with words all the time, but just don't have time to read anything. So that's one thing.
Yeah, I would say that this is difficult stuff. This is not easy stuff. To think and write philosophy, reflect on it, it requires, as Henry says, huge willpower. it's very difficult. It can be hugely frustrating. You don't, and you tend to get, your mind tends to get more clouded, less clear. Now, Berlin used the phrase very well. He said, the more you look at philosophy, the more you can be filled with mental cramp, which I think is a wonderful metaphor.
Cramp.
Mental cramp. Mental cramp, yeah.
The other two. Yeah.
So, and I think that encapsulates how I feel a lot of the time when I'm writing or reading or thinking about philosophy. My mind feels like, it feels authentic, but the more I read, the more I have to deal with, the more confused you can become. And the thing is, though, the big thing that I think these philosophers tend to, especially Williams and Berlin said, and some of the other great philosophers, that problems can be more important, far more interesting than solutions. And the philosophers I like reading are the ones that take a problem really seriously and don't let it go, and don't, for example, believe, like a lot of scientistic philosophers, that they've reached a solution, that they've reached ground zero, which is probably impossible. And any philosopher that claims to do that, and a lot of scientists claim to do that, it's just rubbish.
I think there's a good example of something we disagree about. Yes, I mean, obviously, reaching a solution is difficult, and it may be that it's not something that can be just written down as one line. It's only comprehensible if you've been through the process of discovery that leads to it. But for me, at any rate, the process is motivated by the hope, the belief that you will reach some degree of better understanding as a result of what you're doing. Otherwise, there's no point. I mean, that's a real disagreement between us, I think.
Yes, and I suppose I caveat what I said then. I think I would, rather than using the word solution, maybe what I should have said is illumination. I think you get a higher degree of self-awareness and awareness of the issue. That, to me, rarely elicits a solution in the normal way we look at a solution. Like, we've now solved the problem we were looking at. Like, what is love? What is justice? What is knowledge? When you actually delve into these problems, you find out you're not going to get a conclusive answer to those questions. What you will get is a much greater appreciation of the difficulty of the problem and the sort of things you need to consider to address that question in a way that's illuminating and capacious and hopefully interesting.
Can I just correct one? Possibly, I mean, it may not be a correction, but I think it is, to what you said about reading habits, particularly in Berlin's case. You said he'd read several languages, several things, several times over. My impression is that he read scarcely anything in a kind of start to finish way, but that he dipped in, and he had a terrific capacity to extract the pith of an article or a book almost by just running his eye over it, and that is one way in which you get a lot of stuff under your belt.
That sounds like a lawyer's reading of a
huge
pile of papers, doesn't it? That they can go right to the bit which will win the case.
I edited one book by him on an obscure thinker called Herzen, and I went through all his notes and his typescript, and to slightly simplify, I think he wrote that book without reading a word that Herzen had written.
You heard that here, folks.
It reminds me of the Woody Allen joke, you know, that he just told his mom, come back, Mum, I'm a speed reader now. And she said, that's fantastic. And he said, yeah, I just read War and Peace in 15 minutes. It's based roughly around Russia.
Yeah. So on that note, I think we should open this up for questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand up.
Henry mentioned that Isaiah Berlin was a very frustrating conversationalist. Fascinating, doubtless, but frustrating because you couldn't get a clear enough account of what you were interested in.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you'd like to say something, both of you, about how well you thought he wrote, as opposed to converse.
Okay, so this is a question about Isaiah Berlin, frustrating conversationalist, because he's basically would string a series of anecdotes that were incredibly entertaining but weren't quite on the point.
Yes.
What do you think about how he wrote?
And what do you think there is about him, apart from being an extraordinarily educated man, that makes him worthy of study today?
Okay, a tougher question. What about him is worthy of study today, beyond him just being a highly educated person with an amazing set of resources to draw upon? I mean, do you want to take that first, Johnny, and then?
Okay, on his style, I think he is. For me, I like his style, but it's subjective. You know, I mean, if you like John Rawls, for example, and you like your political theory, pretty neat and analytic, Berlin is not going to be your, your HP sauce or whatever, right? But if you like your political theory, or you like your philosophy full of examples, allusions, a building up of parentheses, a sense that this person has lived a bit in the real world, and that they're bringing their heart as much as their mind into it, and they're as interested in the heart and mind and the context of where the thinker they may be talking about, then I think what people might think is a prolix style, I would consider an entertaining, appealing, attractive style. Also, the kind of writers that Berlin was interested in, he kind of almost aped their style a bit. So the classic example I would think would be someone like Herzen. If you read Alexander Herzen, who was probably Isaiah's greatest hero, he was a 19th century Russian intellectual who left Russia and lived most of his life in Europe, actually part of it in London. He writes very much in a kind of a pre-Berlinian, or Berlin's a neo-Herzenian writer, whatever way you want to look at your history. It's that kind of non-logical way of looking at human problems, which means you have to build up by allusion, you have to build up by example. You're not building up your argument through entailment or logic, a bit like John Rawls or Nozick or even Dworkin does. They kind of write in that kind of analytic style. You kind of take a problem to pieces and then you look at it analytically. Berlin looks at the problem in a much more holistic way.
Yes, I think one of the things Berlin said, which is relevant here, is that an intellectual is someone who wants ideas to be as interesting as possible, and that's certainly something you get from his writing, and something you don't get from some of the analytic writers. So he was formed, I think, partly by reading most of the classics of Russian literature in his pre-English youth. He only came to England when he was 11. So he'd read War and Peace by the age of 10, for example.
In longer than 15 minutes, presumably.
What?
It took him more than 15 minutes.
It took him more than 15 minutes, yeah. I also think he has a kind of orotundity of style which is reminiscent of the 19th century. I mean, I think he'd read Carlyle and Gibbon and people like that. He wrote complex sentences. They always wind safe to sea in the end, but they're not short, pithy sentences. So stylistically, that's where he's coming from. And I think his style also reflects the answer to the second question, which is why is he important to or interesting to read today. I think he had a timeless and a deep understanding of what it is to be a human being, of human nature and its potential, which comes out, breathes through every sentence he wrote. And so that to me will always be a reason to read him.
Just as an aside, I wrote some teaching material I used to work for the Open University for 20 years, and I wrote a book about freedom, which had a section on Isaiah Berlin, and I quoted a long passage from the Two Concepts of Liberty, and the sub-editor didn't realise that it was in inverted commas, and I got it back covered in these blue pencil marks. All the sentences were broken into shorter sentences, long words crossed out. Yeah, question.
Thank you. In view of the current wind of liberalism and liberal international order in retreat, and ascendancy of popularism and selfishism, if you like, in ascendancy, what would Isaiah Berlin's advice or prescription be to us? And just one other brief question. I think it was Johnny who actually used the term the negative liberty in your synopsis. Can you explain that a bit further?
Okay, two questions. The first one, liberalism is in decline apparently, populism is on the rise, selfishness is everywhere and promoted. What would Isaiah Berlin how would he react to that? And secondly, Johnny used the phrase negative freedom, negative liberty. Yeah. Negative liberty. Could you just explain that a bit? So, can we take one question each, maybe?
Sure. I'll do the first one. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure how well I shall answer it, but first of all, I think in general, the game of what would some dead person say about something that's going on now is a bit dangerous, and who can say? You know, I mean, one doesn't really want to put oneself in the position of somebody who's a great deal more intelligent and well-read than oneself. But it's clear from his writings that he would regret and want to combat the demise or the apparent demise of liberal thought. And he would say that in fact he does say in the beginning of his inaugural lecture that ideas have terrific power, and in the wrong hands they can be very damaging. And it's the responsibility of public intellectuals, in particular, say, professors in Oxford or whatever, to combat these, to make sure that the weaknesses of these ideas and the alternatives to them are out in the public marketplace and can be seen and imbibed by people. And so he'd say, I mean, he wouldn't say it, but I would say on his behalf, read my books.
Right?
Yeah, so on the question of negative liberty, I think that's, as Henry answered the first question, I think, so negative liberty, basically Berlin wrote this, it's probably his most famous, his two most famous essays are his essay on Tolstoy, The Hedgehog and the Fox, and probably Two Concepts of Liberty, his inaugural lecture as Ciccielli professor in Oxford. On one level you could say that Berlin's argument is kind of just a rewarming up of Mill's essay on liberty, 100 years, literally almost 100 years to the day before. But I think that would be doing it an injustice. So, very straightforwardly, is the concept of negative liberty basically means I am free from interference from people getting involved in my life. Okay? So I'm free to be an atheist, I'm free to believe in God, I'm free to be really lazy, I'm free to be really busy. Whatever I choose to do in my life, that should be protected. I should have this area cordoned off to me where I can choose to do what I want. And Berlin felt that was really important. Positive liberty, which is contrasted with negative liberty, is kind of the freedom to do things, or maybe the freedom politically to impose things on people. So, for example, if you live in an egalitarian state, you might say we have the freedom to raise taxes quite heavily so we can redistribute wealth in a more fair way. If you live in a place, for example, like America today, you could call that a more ultra-libertarian state, where and really where people's freedom to do whatever they want, but only in certain ways, is put at the cost of maybe a redistribution of wealth. So that's where positive liberty comes in. But I think the real value of negative liberty is negative liberty becomes really important in a world that is fundamentally pluralist. Because I need to know I've got the choice to have my own experiment in life, to choose my own way of life, and my freedom to do that is vital in a world which is necessarily a conflictual world where we've got different ideals, and I must choose whatever ideal or way of life I want to live. And Berlin felt that that was a sacred thing. That liberty is almost more precious than life itself. So it's not negative liberty in a vacuum, it's negative liberty in the context of where we are in modernity.
Could we take this opportunity to clear up what I think is a misunderstanding of Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty, which is the caricature is that he was against positive liberty.
No.
Right? So he's fairly clear that he isn't, but many people summarise him as if he thinks, negative liberty, freedom to do what you want, this inviolable space around each adult to choose and make their own mistakes, the kind of John Stuart Millian sense of liberty is all that matters. But he's explicit that positive liberty is an ingredient in a good life. I take it that he just was saying something like, in the history of humanity, positive conceptions of liberty have more often and more dramatically been used to suppress people and produce disastrous outcomes, taking Rousseau's notion of forcing people to be free, the apparent contradiction, as not a contradiction, and then imposing a certain final solution, sometimes literally, on a people because of that positive sense of liberty. And so I've actually heard that on Radio 4, people that come on and say, I want to say, yes, Berlin's notion of concepts of liberty is so important because we need to just emphasise negative liberty, but it's not that at all. I mean, could you confirm that, please?
Yes, I can confirm that. Perhaps just to say briefly about the distortion of positive liberty, he took the view that this depended on initially on the idea that there are two compartments in ourselves. There's the lower self and the higher self. There's our normal physical appetites and desires, and then there's a kind of more responsible and refined a person who tries to keep this lower person under control. And the next step is that this this higher self is then identified or connected with not an individual, but a wider structure, like the political order in society. And so people say the experts, the political experts, they know better than any individual does what's really a decent objective, what's really a way to organise our life, so we can tell you what to do. So positive liberty then becomes a totalitarian form of suppression, so it becomes exactly the opposite of liberty. It's non-liberty, and that's what he's really horrified by and against.
Can I just add an extra
Yes,
point to that?
yes.
Because I think it's not just something that Berlin is a victim of. Most thinkers don't get the legacy they deserve, and one of the ways they get an unjust legacy is because they become victims of these kind of repeated caricatures. Because the caricature is much more digestible, more and more so in the age in which we live, of the instant message. I don't read books, I read tweets. And the tweet would definitely lend itself to a distortion of Berlin's concept of negative. In other words, that he's against.
Depends what the tweet is.
Yes, it does. I shouldn't be too harsh on tweets.
Wittgenstein's tweets are wonderful.
Yes, Wittgenstein. But I think that's a problem for thinkers, that a lot of the time they don't get the
tweeter is
the tweeter they deserve.
tweet people well.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. On this topic of Berlin's writings and freedom, I was wondering, after Berlin passed, there were a couple of people like Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit. A couple of essays and books. They basically argued that there's actually this third concept of freedom, which Berlin sort of occluded, which is neither an absolute faculty of motion, of doing things, or self-mastery, but the simple idea of independence, of not being a thing at the mercy of another. And this, what I find very surprising, because I grew up, reading Two Concepts of Freedom, and then I thought freedom was basically just these two concepts for the longest time, and it was only after reading Skinner that realized that there's this really ancient Roman idea of being sui juris, which I was wondering, is there anywhere which is you find even in Locke, as late as Locke? So I was wondering, it's not possible for Berlin not to have known about this. I'm not familiar with Berlin's writings anywhere as closely as you are. Is there anything in Berlin's corpus where he discusses this idea of freedom?
Okay, so this is quite a complex question to summarise. After Berlin's death, a number of writers, including Philip Pettit and Quentin Skinner, both of who have been on philosophy bites, commented about how Berlin hadn't, or in their writings, talked about a third concept of freedom, which is the freedom not to be pushed around by other people, basically, which is slightly different from the negative liberty, which is you have this space. It doesn't imply that. I think.
Well, is it? That's the question.
Well, yeah,
To
so
me, it's
that's
the same thing. But
I thought, so I'm going to comment on the question as well. And the question is, did Isaiah Berlin not know about this third concept? He would surely have encountered it because it has a long history within the history of ideas.
Can I have a try at this one?
Yeah. Can I just comment on the
Oh,
question?
yes, yeah.
We should get clear exactly what it is, because I thought there was within Quentin Skinner, you probably know this better than me, within his writing, he talks about a Republican sense of, and that's possibly clearer. Is that the label? That's what we're talking about, the Republican sense of freedom.
Republican as opposed to liberal.
Yeah. So, just if you want to look this up afterwards, that's
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about. So, did Berlin not know about this?
of course he did, but Johnny is the expert on this, so...
Well, I'm not sure about the expert, but I have a view on this one, which is quite strong. So I think the first thing I'd say is Berlin did not think that his distinction between negative and positive liberty exhausted the landscape. Okay, he just felt that these were two concepts of liberty that were particularly important in the history of humanity. Okay, but he didn't think in any kind of that there's only two concepts of liberty. Okay, but he felt that most of the concepts of liberty that are out there fall into one of these two concepts, but they're not. They're mutually exclusive, but they're not infinitely exhaustive, I think is what someone might say. The second thing I think Skinner really does have quite a good argument that there is this third concept of liberty. Some people would think that that's a variation on the concept of positive liberty. Okay, so it's this kind of freedom to, as opposed to freedom from. So freedom to is positive liberty, freedom from interference is negative liberty. Skinner would say, no, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that I want that negative liberty, or sorry, his third concept of liberty is the view that I want to impose on people. Okay? He says, but this third concept of liberty, the kind of neo-Roman concept of liberty, that really was very prevalent in Renaissance Italy. For example, in the city republics of Florence and Venice and those sort of places. What he was saying was they were really concerned about the source of their liberty, not just the scope of their liberty. And what he would say to Berlin is, you're assuming that someone's going to mind your negative liberty for you. But you've forgotten that the source of that liberty lies with the people. And unless the people really start thinking about the source of their negative liberty, which even Quentin Skinner is sacred. He's as much a Berlinian in that regard. But he says that Berlin is forgetting about the source of liberty. And that's what these Republican theorists were talking about and which he wants to resuscitate. Because he says, especially in the current context of populism, where our freedoms could be easily curtailed by what we call an elective dictatorship, and that unless we're really careful about our liberties and we really take democracy seriously and we're actively looking out for our liberties are in huge jeopardy. And we could say that's one of the big problems with populism, or for example, you might say Trump, where civil liberties are constantly getting curtailed, but to what end? And are people really noticing this? Well, if you're into Skinner, you would be really noticing it and you'd be trying to do something about it.
Only that to agree with Johnny's starting point, because in Two Concepts of Liberty, he actually says at the beginning there are over 200 senses of liberty. I mean, he actually gives a number. I mean, doesn't say what they are, of course, but yeah.
That reminds me, I saw Bernard Williams once say, oh, there are 7 objections to that, and then reel off, 7, or maybe he said 5, but it was some unreasonably high number.
Yeah.
Had he really counted them?
No, no, he got it from some article. But I mean, the answer, in my view, there is no absolute number of concepts of liberty. It depends how you slice things up. You can have an infinite number or just one, different extremes of your analytical structure.
There's a nice distinction between a concept and a conception.
Yeah.
So you can have a concept of something, but then you can have a multitude of conceptions of that or versions of that. And I think that's what we're in. And we're in a concept that is kind of what you might say is inherently contestable. There's no one true conception of liberty, I would think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as for the Republican thing, I think Berlin would, I would say that the idea that you have to be free of this kind of domination is absolutely present in his writings again and again. He doesn't present it as a third concept of liberty. In fact, I would say he would probably classify it as one of the conditions of liberty rather than as liberty itself. And he was very keen on keeping separate things separate. He said everything is what it is and not another thing, and I would think he would apply that here.
He was quoting them, wasn't he?
He was quoting Bishop Butler, yes. Joseph
Just
Butler.
to get the footnote correct there.
Yes, yes.
And who better to supply it than Henry?
What?
I knew you'd know. You've probably got the chapter and verse on that, haven't you?
Well, yes, it's section 16 of Pope something or other. I can't remember exactly.
Oh no, but you know where to look it up.
I do.
This is what we all need.
Yes, yes.
Instead of a paperclip popping up and telling you what to do, we need a Henry. You've misquoted that. Question here.
Yeah, I was wondering, in light of what you said about Berlin's conception of plurality and the absence of a final solution, but then also the importance of thought and the power of ideas, what is the responsibility of individuals to critically evaluate their options and to come to a decision even if it's not the only possible decision. But what does he say about kind of the process that we should all engage in when we make decisions?
This is a really interesting question. Given the incommensurability of the different ways of living, the complexity of the historical situation, as individuals, what responsibility do we have in sort of going through the process of thinking about the ideas which inform our lives? Is that a fair summary? Okay, great.
It's a good question. I mean, I would guess. I mean, can't remember whether he addressed it specifically in these terms, but I would say he wouldn't maintain that there was an absolute duty for every single person to do this process of self-examination, because the vast majority of human beings have no taste, or dare I say it without being accused of some sort of prejudice, ability to go through these processes. Many people are perfectly happy to live in a traditional way of life which is not self-consciously self-questioning all the time, and I don't think you can say that that's a bad way of living. It's one of the ways of living that's open to us. So, but at the same time, he would certainly stress the importance of education as a way of combating mistaken ideas, or creating the ability in people to be able to criticize and resist bad arguments in the political forum. So education is very important.
It's interesting because obviously Socrates allegedly said the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being.
Well,
it's okay for cattle.
Exactly. Well, that seems to me a form of bias in favour of intellectuals, and it's quite unrealistic.
Yeah, I would go a little bit further on this one. I pin my colours to the mast a bit more, and I pin Berlin's colours to the mast a bit more. I think when you try and boil down why he thinks that liberalism is better than other types of ideology, I think he's saying that because liberalism can deal with knowledge better, right? And if you stop thinking that knowledge and truth are important, well then liberalism and an open society and a tolerant society start to lose their appeal and value. And I think that's really, really important to Berlin. So while he wouldn't want to legislate that we all become philosophers, maybe sad philosophers, as opposed to Plato called them happy pigs or happy fools. So I'm not suggesting he says we all need to live a reflective life, but I think he's saying that when we reflect on it, we do see that things like knowledge and truth are important. And when you explore those things, you find out they're really complicated, and that that knowledge and truth need a liberal, tolerant, open society, especially if you value knowledge and truth. If you don't, well then you might go for a very different type of society where we all plug ourselves into some sort of, brain in a vat, and we're all living pleasurable lives, but it's got nothing to do with reality. This is the classic, philosopher's experiment, where, if I could actually take a pill that made me happy and feel happy, why would I not take that pill? What's stopping me taking a happy pill? Well, because you might say, if I take the happy pill, I stop being human in some really important way where I have the capacity to be sad, or to follow one value at the cost of another. Because this happy pill gets rid of all that. So what stops us taking the happy pill? For me, reading Berlin might give you another reason not to take the happy pill.
That same reason would stop you going on a yoga retreat, though, wouldn't it?
Well, it depends. The happy pill is forever. The yoga retreat is usually temporary.
Another question? Really?
What's the time?
So you've got 5 minutes. You can ask a question, yes?
Henry mentioned that you studied as a Beatle at Wolfson. Did you have the pleasure of being taught by Berlin, and how was he, if so?
Okay, so the question, just so you can hear, the question was, Henry studied for BPhil at Wolfson College, Oxford, and Isaiah Berlin was then the Provost? What was his official title?
President.
The president.
President of Wolfson,
Thank you.
yes,
The president.
yes.
Were you ever taught by him?
Not formally, no. People often say, on no basis in books, that I was his student. I never was his student. I was his student in a broader, humane sense, in that I studied his works and spent hours and hours talking to him about things. So in that sense, I was a student. But no, he wasn't my supervisor. And I should have thought that he would have been in many ways a very unsatisfactory supervisor for much the reason that I gave earlier. Going off to tangent, you'd be absolutely fascinated, but probably none the wiser in the ways that you need to.
Did he teach? I mean, in a formal way?
Oh yes. I mean, by the time he was president of Wolfson, he was probably only taking on doctoral students as a supervisor. So he certainly did that, and I could name some of the people who he supervised. But no, Robert Wokler, for example, would be one. But anyway, there was, and also the Israeli ex-minister of education, Yuli Tamir. He supervised her thesis on liberal nationalism. So he but before he went to Wolfson, in fact, his immediately previous job, 10 years, was Chichely Professor of Social and Political Theory, which is attached to All Souls, where he gave a number of courses of lectures on the history of political thought, which some of which have appeared as transcripts and articles.
Can I just say that one of the best kept secrets is Henry's PhD, or DPhil as it's called here, which I've had the pleasure of reading last year on subjective experience. And it's one of the, I thought it was fun. It's amazing it hasn't been published. I hope it will be someday, but a lot of people don't know that Henry is a bona fide philosopher. And this is one of the great pieces that I hope will be addressed in the near term, because I know your thesis is available on the.
It's online.
It's
yes.
online, and I'd invite anyone to read it, because it's actually Thomas Nagel before Thomas Nagel.
Praise indeed.
One last question from anybody? Okay, well, I think we should end there and give you a chance to run over to the desk and pick up both books and pay for them. And by that time, my two excellent guests will be ready to sign them. So could you just, whether or not you're going to do that, can you show your appreciation at least by clapping? The longest applause of any speakers we've had here, so that's a good, unless you're kind of getting the hand gel off your hands. Thank you very much.